Okay, so now it's been a little over a year and over 1,100 miles since I picked up my 2019 CRF450L. So I figured now that I've had this bike for a year and we've done a bunch of modifications to it, I'm finally ready to talk about this bike in detail. But I am a little late to the party. There's a lot of other reviews out on this bike on YouTube right now. So why should you listen to this one? Let's go ahead and take a look at a quick look back at the last year of owning this bike. And then after watching that, it'll help you determine if my experience is going to be relevant to you.
What we're watching right now is a man who has no kickstand try to find a place to park. And that's what people are talking about, the flame out right there. You can just see there's that jerk with the bike.
In fact, today might be better than the day I bought my motorcycle. Today's the day, finally, that we're getting the Vortex ECU in and the Yoshimura exhaust.
Now, we're smooth.
See, kids, when you won't put the potato chips down, this is what you got to do. There we go. Down. Might have been easier just to go on a diet, lose all the weight instead. We're going to put the Yoshimura exhaust, the Vortex ECU, the thermostat delete kit. We're going to put a new camshaft in, new rockers, and new valve springs. In theory, at the end of this video, this bike's going to start back up.
Okay, so that obviously didn't work, so we'll be back later.
So before we get into the full review of this bike, I do want to make a quick comment. This specifically is a 2019 CRF450L. Honda made the L for 2019 and 2020. Then in 2021, Honda came out with the RL. And really, my understanding that if you look at that, it's got kind of a different all red plastic pattern, which Yamaha's doing that with their 2021 all blue, and it's, you know, just that's the current theme. They made notes in there though that they revised the ignition system. Well, unfortunately, I'm here to tell you, which we'll talk about more later in the video, initial reports are that the 2021 still has the jerky throttle that this bike and the 2020 suffered from as well. So that has not gone away. So aside from different graphics and a different name, this review will apply to, at this time, all Honda 450Ls and 450RLs. As we go through this video, I want you to keep something in mind. Previously on a different video when I got this bike, I did a comparison of this bike against my dad's at the time CRF450L. And this is what I had to say about the names. Now when Honda named this 450, they didn't name it the XL, they didn't name it the RL, they named it the CRF450L. It is the same name as that 250 except it went from a 2 to a 4. So regardless of what chassis line this belongs to, we're going to compare them today, if only because they share the same name. Now I knew how different those bikes were. That's why I did the video. But at the same time, when you were shopping Honda's website and you go to the dual sport range and you got these bikes with the same names, the 250L, 450L, 650L, your average person wanting to get into dual sport riding doesn't know the differences. And if you aren't fully versed in the differences of those bikes, I'll put the video for my 250 versus 450 and 450 versus 650 in the links below. But I knew what I was doing. I knew what was going on, and I was just kind of having fun with comparing the two bikes because Honda used the same naming convention. So I thought it was really appropriate that Honda in 2021 renamed this bike. But they still got it wrong, okay? So what I thought would be fun is you go through this video, I want to see if you can agree with me that what this bike should have been called all along was the CRF450XL. The RL is still a wrong name for this bike. So keep that in mind as we go through this video. So Honda's been making 450s for a long time. And let's look back to 2005 when Honda brought out their carbureted CRF450X. That bike in typical Honda fashion ran for 12 years to 2017 with basically no changes to the bike. In 2017, Honda revamped the 450R, and it's that engine design in that model that you have in here. So in 2018, Honda only had the 450R. They didn't have the X or the 450L. So in 2019, we got a brand new CRF450X and a CRF450L. So what Honda did was they took the 450R platform and created two new bikes off of it. Now Honda already had the CRF450RX. What's an RX? I mean, we've got 4 models here. So the RX is basically just an R. It's the same motor, closed ratio 5-speed transmission, but it's got a kickstand and different valve suspension for competition off-road riding, not at a motocross track, even though it will still do motocross. Same exhaust, everything else. So that bike is very much appropriately named. But when Honda released the CRF450X, they looked at the motor and they're like, okay, so this is gonna be used for maybe Baja riding, a lot of off-road riding. Closed ratio 5-speed transmission isn't right. So let's go ahead and widen the motor and let's put a 6-speed wide ratio transmission in it. This bike has that transmission. Okay, what about the motor? Well, the 450R's free revving motor can stall out a little easier. The camshaft design is very aggressive. So let's go ahead in the 450X, let's put in a 3-ring piston, taller piston skirt, and a different camshaft in it. This bike has those 2 parts too. Okay, so now we've got a motor that's about 5 pounds heavier and it's wider because of the transmission. Can't put it in the 450R chassis or frame, so we got to widen the chassis and frame. Okay, they had to do that here too. Do you see what I'm getting at? The 2021 450RL has an X motor in it. Now the difference is though, because this bike's street legal, Honda had to comply with EPA regulations. So the ignition box is different than the 450X and the exhaust is different than the 450X. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a dyno for the 450X, but this bike's stock dyno's in at 38 rear wheel horsepower, and the 450R and RX both dyno in at the same 53.7 in 2019. So now on this bike, one of the things I'll comment about the power for the 38 horsepower, if you're actually riding off-road, is actually quite a bit of power. It's more than enough power, especially for a bike that comes in at 289 pounds wet. The more limiting factor here is actually the tires that come on this bike stock. Now on my note, I actually bought the Tux D-type tires probably 7 months ago and haven't put them on yet. And I've actually worn down my rear one compared to stock pretty far. But the reason I did that was I never had my endorsement. So I'm like, okay, you know, I really finally need to get my endorsement done. And so I finally got my Washington State endorsement. And one of those tests is a emergency braking test from 25 to 0. I didn't want to put worse pavement tires on there to then go take a test in front of an instructor. So I left these tires on. At this point, the year is pretty much done. So I'm just gonna wear them out and then next year we'll start with better tires. So while the tires on here really aren't the best for off-road, I'll say for pavement, you know, they're actually pretty good. So depending on what type of riding you're gonna do, you'll find out quickly whether you wanna get rid of these or not. But I will tell you, if it is muddy and slick, these fill fast and I almost bit it hard washing out the front end. Okay, so we're back to our differences on here. So we were kind of capping over the motor on here. Now the biggest problem with this engine stock wasn't how quiet the exhaust was. It was too quiet, but it's not really a problem, that's a personal preference. It wasn't that the stock exhaust with its catalytic converter weighed 10 pounds more than a conventional exhaust. Again, that's kind of a preference if you want your bike lighter. The problem was, and everybody's talked about it from Rocky Mountain ATV and their comparison to the KTM, was the jerky throttle on this bike that the 2021 still has. And so the true source of that problem is that once the bike's past kind of a rolling speed, when you let go of the gas, it cuts the fuel to the bike. So then when you go to apply the gas again, you go from off to on and it creates a lurch. It lurches the bike forward.
So So if I rev it up, we're coming down, any kind of gas is harsh. Now if I just let the bike roll, so it has to be given fuel right now because we're idling, so if I give it gas right now, hey, we can accelerate smooth. But if I'm coming off of a deacceleration, let's get it up. Now, you can just see there's that jerk with the bike.
And so that led to my desire to go after the Vortex ignition and a different exhaust. And I will tell you, in that clip that I showed before, that drastically cleared that up. This bike is so better smooth now. This is the way it was meant to be. So on here, now the benefit of the Vortex and changing the exhaust is you get about an extra 8 horsepower. And that extra 8 horsepower on here is fantastically fun, especially on road. I'd done a 0 to 60 video, and the best I could get with the Vortex was 5.2. And that's mainly because I can't keep the front end down. I do think if I would have power shifted it, I forgot to do it, but if I would have power shifted it, like literally sat on the tank and maybe even tried to burn your clutch up third gear start, I could have got sub 5s. This is my bike, I'm still paying for it. I'm only gonna run it so hard. So anyway, 5.2 seconds in current form is the best speed I've gotten on this bike. But again, that's because 30 and under, you can't keep the front end down. So trust me, this feels fast. And 0 to 40 is just ridiculously fast on this bike. So it's a lot of fun, and it's a lot of fun off-road or on-road. Now stock out of this motor, you're pulling about 58 to 60 miles per gallon. And I've done miles per gallon. I did a comparison video looking at the gas mileage of this versus a 250L, and honestly, we're about the same. Partly because the 250L is turning more RPMs at certain speeds. But if you're riding with gas mileage in mind, this actually does very well. So at a 2-gallon stock tank, you're looking at about 100 to 120 mile range. Now, when I went to the Vortex, this hand really controls what your gas mileage is going to be. I've seen as low as 35 off-road. With the way the bike is right now, I honestly am trying to keep my rides at 80 miles round trip or under, because even though I can go a little over 80, do you really want to be pushing it to where you're worrying about walking home? It's just a little too far. Okay, so while this motor is R-inspired and I'm committed to my decision that this is an X motor made for the street, hence the XL, one of the coolest things about the entire lineup is the front forks and rear suspension of this bike are straight off of the motocross bike. In fact, that's one of the reasons why the cost is as high as it is on this bike, because you're getting full motocross components on here. But what they did though, is they changed the valving and spring rates in here to make it more appropriate for a dual sport. But I will tell you from experience, it's amazing what one click, either on your compression, rebound, front or rear, does for the bike. Now, because the extra weight I tend to pack on, and the fact that I'm trying to follow my kids off-road and do a little bit of motocross riding and varied riding with them, I did a different video where we upgraded the spring stiffness on the bike. So I went to a 6.3 kg spring in the rear, which was quite a bit of a step up. And if I wasn't doing the track riding with the kids, I would have just done the rear. But because I also want to be able to jump this thing pretty well, we went up 1 spring rate stiffer on the springs. And simply all I did is I ordered the springs from Rocky Mountain ATV by going to the Honda 450R OEM parts catalog, and I ordered the optional stiffer springs, because this bike actually comes with the same front fork springs as the 450R. It's valved differently. So I will tell you, as a follow-up to that video, the first third of the stroke felt great, but then as it transitioned to the second third, it got really stiff really quick. And in fact, when I went off a jump once, the front end didn't progressively kind of compress down, and it about hucked me too far forward on the handlebars. So since then, I've loosened the front compression clickers about 4, and it's amazing how each one goes, the progression rate of the springs is changing. So again, out of this box, amazing suspension setup, and it is impossible to spring a bike for just any one person. So I don't hold any fault to Honda for the way this bike comes out of the box. It's fantastic. Now, one thing I will complain about a little bit on here, and I did another video of it on it, just kind of ranting, is the stock weight limit on this bike for rider and cargo and gear is 220 pounds. I had too much fun at my 40th birthday party. I weigh more than 220 pounds standing here right now, let alone once I put all my gear and stuff on. So that is a little low. Now, is that rating based on the chassis? Is the rating based on the stock spring rates? I don't know. I don't care. The bike handles it just fine. In fact, if you watch, I think he calls his channel John T. Young. I subscribe to him. But anyway, he's got an 450L, and he's turned it into a light adventure bike, and he's always got tons of gear on the bike, and his is handled just fine. So there's not a chassis problem on here. Now, going back to what we were talking about, the 450R and the RX, this is a different frame than those bikes. This is actually basically the X frame, but what's different on here though is all the way through the back section to the tail, Honda reinforced that actually with metal framing. And then on the stock license plate holder, that was metal reinforced too. And so if you compare it to the KTMs that just flop everywhere, that extra reinforcing is very, very evident when the bike's in motion. And it kind of speaks to Honda's quality. Now, some people have actually done a mod where they chop that off for weight savings and put a 450X fender in the back, and that's fine. What I'm actually gonna do, instead of upgrading to the IMS gas tank, I think I'm gonna go ahead and start with a rear rack on here, and then I'm just gonna carry a 2-gallon gas can on the back when I need it. Okay, so also on the tail of my bike, I did get rid of the stock license plate setup, mainly because if I have that setup on there and I crash off-road or at the racetrack, which is likely, let's be honest, you know, you go down on bikes sometimes. I just thought that setup would get twisted and all tweaked out. So I went ahead and got rid of that. So when I go to the track, I take the license plate off and it's very minimalistic back there. Now I have decided to stick for now with the stock mirrors. They do their job. There's nothing wrong with them and they twist off pretty easy. So going into my background a little bit, I used to have a 2005 450X that I talked about, and I thought that was the best bike I'd ever ridden, and it was for trail riding, kind of mixed use at the off-road park. Then I went to the motocross track with my brother-in-law and I cleared my first tabletop, and I just thought that was amazing. That was so fun. But then he told me to try it on his 450R, and I couldn't believe how different those bikes actually felt on a racetrack. And so then I spent probably 5 or 6 years with a 450R on a racetrack. Never competitively raced. It was just something for us to do to get away from the work week and go do on the weekends. And we only went like 8 to 10 times a year, but it was a lot of fun. Enjoyed doing it. But one of the things I've noticed as a taller person, I'm 6'2", and you know, always 220 to 230 on weight, it seems like. But these bikes are designed for people who are shorter and weigh less. So I always felt pretty big on them, even though these bikes are far more than I can handle. Well, one of the nice, pleasant surprises on here, I believe, has come from the wheelbase. Now, I can't remember these, so I got to save them. 450R has a wheelbase of 58.4 inches. Now, the tighter your wheelbase, better bike corners. But the longer your wheelbase, the better stability is. So the 450X wheelbase is 58.7. And so again, this is a 450X chassis, but one of the things Honda did is they put a longer swing arm on this one. So then the 450L goes up 0.2 inches and is a 58.9 inch wheelbase. And I think with my taller stature, when I ride this off-road, I feel very, very confident with this chassis off-road. And I believe for my size, a lot of that has to do with the longer wheelbase. I actually like it better. I feel like that high-speed straight line stability they were going for me, makes this a very nice bike to ride off-road. Now, Honda did fill the swing arm with some type of foam for, again, noise. I don't know how much weight that added. Pop quiz for the people in the comments. Is your swing arm sprung or unsprung weight? It's tied to the wheel. I don't know. Anyway, if you guys know which one that is, go ahead and put it in the comments below. Because a fun fact, for every pound of unsprung weight is the equivalent of 7 pounds sprung weight on there. So if you don't know the difference between sprung and unsprung, go ahead and look it up. I don't want to kill too much time here. Okay, so if you saw it in a previous video, my brother-in-law, who I used to ride with at the track, he had an XR 650L. And after doing the comparison video with that and the drag race we did on the street, I let him ride at home and he was hooked. Because he, like me, we used to have those motocross bikes. We used to take those bikes home and only be able to look at them in the garage. And we used to think, man, how fun would it be, just because I'm dying to go for a little ride, would it be to take our motocross bikes on the street? Well, obviously that's illegal. This bike gives you that feeling. You feel like you're back on your motocross bike and being able to go on the road. And so shortly thereafter, he sold that bike and picked up a 450L. But he wanted to have as much power as possible. Now, he will say, and he's a good spirits about it, that he's a heavier guy. So power to weight ratio, he said he needed that kit just to get the same feeling I have on here. And I don't think that's completely that far apart on here. So what he ordered is he ordered the kit from San Diego Powerhouse. It included a new camshaft, rocker arms, valve springs. In fact, I think the valve springs are just simply the ones from the 450R. And the vortex that comes with it is programmed for the different camshaft. They claim from stock of 38 rear wheel horsepower, you're gaining 19 extra horsepower. So you're talking about 57 rear wheel horsepower, which would be 4 more than a stock 450R. Now, I will tell you, as embarrassing it was in that video, we reassembled the motor wrong in a very simple way. This camshaft design is different than the 450X and old 450R I used to have. So I had an 05 and an 06. And now with the new design, what it is the camshaft has sliding guides on it, and you have to make sure those are pinched tightly inside of the head. If you don't, the bearings slide out and the bike loses power. So that's what happened to us when we put it back together. So once we figured that out and fixed it, we didn't want to run it hard for a while. Now he has about 600 miles on the bike, and I can tell you, I've only gotten to do it just briefly, but on road you can really, really feel that power difference. And so what he did is he actually picked up the Vortex ignition switch, so he can pick 2 different mappings on the fly, because 19 extra horsepower off-road, unless you're in loose, deep sand like Baja Racing, which was kind of their intent, that's a lot of extra power. And so you want to be able to map that out differently on here. So watch for us to do a follow-up video here. It may have to wait till next spring, but we're going to do a follow-up video to really see the rideability difference between the way I have this bike and with his kit. We'll do some 0 to 60 comparisons. So we'll flush that out more later. But for him, he feels like that his current 450L is as fast or faster than his 06 450R was, and he even had smaller sprockets on it. So he had that geared with a White Brothers pipe, smaller sprockets. I remember riding that bike thinking it was too fast for me. And so if he's saying that new kit makes his bike feel as fast or faster, that kind of puts it into perception here, what that kit does for you. Now, unfortunately, the biggest thing people are probably waiting for me to talk about is what's the maintenance like? A lot of people were disappointed when Honda brought this bike out because the maintenance was completely different than the 250L and the 650L. And if I want to give Honda credit, if there's a reason they picked the name for RL, I think it might have been more of a perception. I am holding to the technicality that the bike should be called an XL, but I think the RL was more so the perception of, you know, this isn't really, you know, a daily driver for work or a grocery getter type bike. This bike is a competition street legal bike. And with competition, which the R is synonymous with, comes higher maintenance. So in the manual, this bike states that you need to change the oil every 600 miles. Now, people have been sending their oil out to, I think it's Blackstone Labs, and they've been doing different interval experiments. And it seems like 1,000 miles, even at 1,000 miles, they're saying you could stretch the oil out longer. I think most people who are going for longer oil changes are sticking with the 1,000-mile range. But you got to think about it from Honda's standpoint. If you're just out on the road in 6th gear riding, the strain on the engine is completely different than taking this to a track or entering a race. So it's really hard to know exactly where they should put the interval, so Honda is playing it safe. The other thing they're playing it safe with is the valve check intervals. Every 1,800 miles, you should check the valves. Now, I'm a firm believer in knowing how to work on what you own, and they're not that hard to do on here. I already did it once just to see, and we'll probably check my brother-in-law's bike this winter. So just for the heck of it, since we have his bike torn apart, I'm probably going to check mine again, even though I'm only at 1,100 miles. But on other people, John T. Young, there's one gentleman on Thumper Talks forum who's now crossed over 20,000 miles. Their valves are holding rock solid, which is amazing. It really shows the progression and evolution, because it used to be on my 450R, I had to change the shims once a year at least. But that 20,000 mile mark that this gentleman has passed is kind of key, because the top end, according to Honda, needs to be rebuilt at 20,000 miles, which is quite different than some previous models. And again, I think that comes down to how high are you turning the RPMs? How aggressively are you cranking on this motor? So if you think about it, if you're at the racetrack, you're going off a jump and you don't pull the clutch or something like that, and you slam the brake in the rear air, lock it up to tilt your front end down, or you're banging gears or driving aggressively, the strain on the motor, the strain on the cam chain, all that is so variable. It's almost impossible to say what this should be. So I do think if you're looking to ride this primarily street, fire roads, comfortable cruising, I think 20,000 is probably going to be way too conservative, and I'm expecting to see people pass 30,000 miles without problems. Again, that's just speculation. Comes down to individual use. But if I look at this for myself, hopefully next year I put more than 1,100 miles on in a year. You're still talking, for me and my use, probably 10 years before I'm going to get to that 20,000. Maybe that'll change, maybe it won't. But in fact, I actually store this at my dad's house in his shop because I ride with my kids. My son's got a YZ65, the other one has a CRF450L. And this next spring, we're probably doing the upgrade. So my oldest is going to get an 85, and we're going to give my middle son the 65. And so part of the thing for me when I was shopping for this bike was, well, I want to go ride on the road. Well, I want to go out and do some forest roads. Well, I want to go to the off-road park, and I want to follow the kids around. There are not a lot of machines that fit the acceptable criteria for me to pick this bike. Now, KTM is the biggest thing I see in the comments. Why didn't you get the KTM 500? Why didn't you get the Husky 701? You know, all these rattled off. And I'll just tell you a couple reasons why. Yes, those are amazing machines, and I'm not trying to pick a fight, but I know Honda. I know Honda reliability, and overall Honda's given that to me, so I did want to stick with what I know. Now, I've seen other videos where some people said they're switching from like a 701 to this bike, partly because depending on the type of riding you're doing, this is a narrow chassis, this weighs less, and if you don't need the power the 701 provides, this might make more sense. I'm not bashing KTM or anything. I'd love to try one, but for me, I felt a lot safer buying the bike I knew, buying the brand I knew, and all the parts I already had, like the shims, they're the same. So this just made more sense. Okay, so kind of coming down here to some of the final differences on here, I will say we're getting into the miscellaneous stuff on here. The 450X gets the same speedometer this does, but it doesn't get an LED headlight, which is weird. Thankfully, Honda gave this bike the full LED treatment. At the end of the day, I love this bike and I would buy it all over again. Now, the one complaint I did have about the bike when I bought it, and I've addressed it before, is the price was too high, $10,399. Honda has for 2021 lowered it to $99.99. I think there is a mental barrier that is associated with crossing 5 digits for a dirt bike, because at the end of the day, this is a street legal dirt bike. And that's one reason why I love it so much. And I'll stand by my naming convention. If you know Honda models and you understand the difference between off-road and motocross bikes, if I tell you this is a CRF450XL tamed down for street use, for most people, you will instantly understand what I'm talking about. And so if you didn't know that coming into this video, hopefully that makes a lot more sense now. Another thing I love about this bike though, is this platform is so flexible. There's so much you can do with it depending on the type of riding you want to do. And if you buy it now in a couple years, change how you want to go, there's a good chance this bike can adapt with you. Might cost a little bit of money in parts, but it can change with you. And I think before we end the video, we should hit a couple quick dislikes. I dislike the stock seat. I did pick up a seat concept seat, which I'm going to do a comparison on because my brother-in-law and I each got different versions of the seat concepts. Thumbs up on that. That's the way to go. So I don't like the stock seat. I don't like all the emission equipment on here. That's fine. It's not a big deal. I've just never liked all the clutter because it makes it harder to work on. I'm very glad they put a fan on here because the CRF450X didn't get one, but you have to with city traffic. Let me see what else. There's not a lot of dislikes on this bike. Be honest with you, my dislike list is pretty short. I think it's partly because I knew going into this bike that I was going to dislike some things. I knew going into it, I wanted my handlebars taller, so I went with the Wyndham bend that I'm used to. I knew going into it that the tires weren't going to be that great. I knew going into it that the ignition was a problem. So I would say if Honda could just fix the ignition for a $10,000 bike, most people would only need to change creature comforts. Most people would only need to change tires and handlebars to their preference, and you could take off. The ignition hesitation is unfortunate on this bike, but I don't know that with modern day EPA and regulations, there's much you can do about it. So I'd rather have it the way it is. I'd rather have it be available for sale and than not have it at all. So thank you, Honda, for bringing this bike out. I'm a little disappointed Yamaha hasn't taken their WR series bikes and brought in a street legal one yet, because while I haven't ridden one, I've heard nothing but really great things about those bikes. And I think competition amongst manufacturers is actually very healthy. I like to say right now for our family, we ride red, smoke blue. So as we go through the 2-strokes, we'll be sticking with Yamaha. And for right now, for the 4-strokes, we'll go and stick with Honda because that's what we know. Well, thanks for watching the video with me. Hopefully I hit all the points and comments that maybe you had questions about or things you're wondering about. If I missed something, go ahead and put a question in the comments below and I'll be sure to answer it for you. There's just so much about this bike to potentially talk about that it's hard to remember it all. But I think we hit the key points on here. I think if you're looking at buying a CRF450L or RL, now after watching this, hopefully this gives you a much better perception of what you're buying, and not only what you're buying, what it can become, because this has just been a fantastic bike for me. From here, my final modifications are tires, radiator guards. I am going to put the thermostat delete kit on it this winter, and then I'm probably going to do some breakaway clutch and brake leverages, because those are one of those things where at some point when you dump it, they snap pretty easy, because I mean they're supposed to. So yeah, other than that, this is the bike. I love it, and if you've enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel because you're going to see a lot more of it. All right, thanks for watching. Honda made it so that once you're moving, if you guys hear that? There's a frog in the shop. Okay, so we've got a frog.